January 2nd, 2022, third quarter, MetLife Stadium. The Jets and the Buccaneers, a game that meant almost nothing in the standings. And then, in the middle of a live drive with the ball in play and 60,000 people in the building, Antonio Brown peeled off his jersey, threw his shoulder pads into the stands, ran across the back of the end zone in his bare feet, waved to the crowd like a man finishing a show nobody else knew had started. He jogged up the tunnel and was gone. The game kept going. Tom Brady, his quarterback, stood on the sideline looking at the space where his receiver used to be. We all watched it happen. Most of us laughed. Some uncomfortable laugh where you're not sure if what you just saw was funny or something else entirely. And within about 4 hours, the clips were everywhere. The memes were already running. But here's what I want to sit with for a second before we get into anything else. Between 2010 and 2022, Antonio Brown signed NFL contracts worth over $150 million. When he walked off that field in New Jersey, shirtless, done, finished, he had less than $50,000 to his name. 2 years later, he filed for bankruptcy. That is the story. Not the catches, not the helmet, not the shirtless jog. The question, the one that has been sitting there since 2019 when this whole thing really came apart, is a simple one. How does the best receiver in football end up broke? And was it really all his own doing? I've been looking into that for a while now. What I found is more complicated than either answer. Here's something most people don't know about Antonio Brown. His father is Antonio Brown Sr., known in certain circles as Action Jackson, a professional arena football player who spent years bouncing around the indoor leagues, never quite making it to the NFL, a talented athlete who lived mostly outside his son's daily life. That detail matters. We'll come back to it. Brown grew up in Miami, and Miami was not good to him early. By 16, he was out of the house, not on his terms. Kicked out, he couch surfed, he slept where he could. He was, by the most accurate account of that period, homeless. Now, we grew up watching certain players and we built stories about them in our heads. For some of us, Antonio Brown was the diva, the distraction, the guy who made it about himself. And by the end, we had evidence for that read. But before any of that, before the helicopters and the Instagram posts and the mid-game exits, there was a 16-year-old kid in Miami with nowhere to go, and a father whose own NFL dream had never materialized. Whatever you think about what came later, you have to start there. Because that kid worked his way through prep schools, not elite football factories, just places that would take him, and found his way to Central Michigan University. Not Ohio State, not Alabama, Central Michigan. The kind of program where you play in front of 15,000 people in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. And you know that the NFL scouts are not making special trips to see you. He was a good college receiver, not a transcendent one. In April 2010, the Pittsburgh Steelers drafted him in the 6th round. Pick number 195. 6 teams passed on him 6 times on the final day of the draft. The Steelers took him as a return man, a special teams contributor, a player you grab at the end of a draft because you need bodies in camp. And sometimes you get lucky. Nobody, and I mean nobody, was writing Hall of Fame projections about Antonio Brown in May 2010. What happened over the next 8 years is one of those things where, even if you watched every game, you might not fully appreciate what you were seeing until you step back from it. From 2013 to 2018, 6 seasons, Antonio Brown put together the most sustained receiving performance in NFL history over that length of time. More catches than Jerry Rice over a comparable 6-year span. He was the fastest player in NFL history to 700 career receptions, not one of the fastest, the fastest. In 2015, he caught 136 passes for over 1,800 yards, including playoffs. That number, 136, is not a mistake. That is a number that, when you say it to anyone who watched that season, still produces a specific kind of reaction. Because defenders knew where he was going. They knew his roots. They had a week to prepare for him. And they still couldn't stop him. Here's the detail that I think matters more than the stats. John Gruden, who spent years coaching in Tampa with Jerry Rice on his roster, who watched Rice work every single day, said that Antonio Brown was the hardest working player he had ever been around in his career. Not one of. The hardest. Above Rice. That sentence landed differently when I found it, because one of the things we were told, and one of the things the later years seemed to confirm, was that Antonio Brown was selfish, that it was all about Antonio Brown. And that read isn't wrong, exactly, but it's incomplete. A selfish player doesn't put in the work that produces 136 catches. A selfish player doesn't have John Gruden, of all people, reaching for the highest comparison he knows and applying it to this specific man. In February 2017, the Pittsburgh Steelers gave Antonio Brown a 4-year extension, $68 million, $19 million upfront in signing bonus. It made him the highest-paid receiver in football. They came to him. He didn't hold out. He didn't threaten to sit. The Steelers looked at what they had and they paid for it. By the fall of 2018, the only real debate about Antonio Brown was where he'd eventually rank all time. Not if he was a Hall of Famer, not whether the money was worth it. Where he'd rank. In the conversation with Rice and Moss and the 4 or 5 other men who had ever played the position at that level. He was 30 years old. He was under contract through 2021. He was the best in the world at his job. The math on his future was simple. Play out this deal, sign another one, and you're looking at a career that clears $200 million. Maybe more if the market kept climbing the way it was climbing. That was the safest bet in football. It didn't hold. Something had been shifting in Pittsburgh for a while, not publicly, not in ways you could point to and name, but the people in that building knew. In January 2018, after the Steelers beat Jacksonville to advance to the AFC Championship, Brown went live on Facebook from inside the locker room. He broadcast Mike Tomlin's private post-game speech, unfiltered, for an audience of over 100,000 people watching in real time, without telling anyone he was doing it. Tomlin was talking about the Patriots, about the upcoming game, about the things you say in a locker room that you say only to the people in that room. The league fined Brown $68,000. That's not the important part. The important part is what it said about where his head was, about the gap that had opened between the team and the man, about the fact that in the single most private moment of a winning season, the locker room after a playoff win, before the biggest game of the year, his instinct was to point a camera at his coach and broadcast it. Nobody made a big thing of it publicly. The season kept going. The Steelers lost to New England in the AFC Championship, but something had shifted, and the people in that building felt it. The 2018 season was the last full year. And toward the end of it, there were reports of friction with Ben Roethlisberger, Ben publicly criticizing him after a game, something that almost never happened in that locker room. Missed practices, a general sense among people close to the team that the arrangement had started running on fumes. Week 17 of the 2018 regular season, Brown reportedly left the stadium at halftime, a game that meant nothing in the standings, against Cincinnati. He never played another down in Pittsburgh. A decade of goodwill, built one catch at a time, one route at a time, starting from the 6th round of the draft when nobody wanted him, spent in about 8 weeks. In March 2019, the Steelers traded Antonio Brown to the Oakland Raiders. Oakland gave him a new 3-year deal, $50 million, $30 million of it guaranteed. John Gruden got the player he had publicly coveted. He called it an answered prayer. He called Brown the hardest worker he'd ever seen. The narrative machine started up immediately. Change of scenery, fresh start, Gruden as the coach who understood him, Oakland as the place where he could rebuild. We've heard that story before. The player who was a problem somewhere else who's going to be different now. Sometimes it's even true. This time, what happened in the first week of training camp in Napa Valley made it immediately, visibly clear that it was not going to be true. Brown arrived at camp, in a helicopter, which is its own statement, with both feet blistered and raw. He had, in the weeks before camp, used a cryotherapy chamber, which athletes do. The procedure requires that you wear protective footwear inside the chamber. He didn't wear the protective footwear. Both feet were damaged enough that he missed significant camp time. You can't make that up. You couldn't write it as fiction because no editor would let it through. Then came the helmet. The NFL had updated its certification standards. Brown's preferred helmet, the model he'd worn for years, the one he was comfortable in, no longer met the new standards. He was told he had to wear a certified helmet. He refused. He threatened to retire rather than switch. He filed a grievance. He went public with it. This went on for weeks. He eventually found an acceptable helmet and backed down. But by then, Gruden's publicly expressed admiration had started to curdle into something more complicated. The Raiders were paying $30 million in guaranteed money to a receiver who had shown up with burned feet and spent the first weeks of camp arguing about headgear. Then it escalated. In August, the Raiders fined Brown for missing practices. Brown responded by posting a photograph of the team's disciplinary letter on Instagram, dollar amounts included. Then he confronted general manager Mike Mayock directly on the practice field in front of his teammates. Mayock later described that sequence in blunt terms: a $30 million guaranteed contract, a helicopter entrance, burned feet, a helmet fight, and then a public confrontation with the man who signed the checks. The Raiders voided his guarantees on grounds of conduct detrimental to the team. They released him before he played a single regular season game. He had arrived in Oakland worth $30 million. He left worth zero. Here is where the timeline gets almost impossible to believe if you didn't live through it. The same week, the Raiders released him. The same week, the New England Patriots called. They signed him to a one-year deal worth $15 million. $9 million of it guaranteed. Tom Brady personally lobbied for him. Bill Belichick, who had a well-documented history of taking players with off-field histories and getting them to fall in line, had apparently decided Brown was manageable. September 7, 2019, Brown signs with New England. September 9th, he plays his first game as a Patriot. 4 catches, a touchdown. The Patriots win 43-0 in Miami. September 10th, a federal civil lawsuit becomes public. Brittany Taylor, a former trainer who had worked with Brown, alleged rape and sexual assault on 3 separate occasions, in 2017 and 2018, while he was in Pittsburgh, while he was signing that $68 million extension. A second accuser emerged within days. The Patriots cut Antonio Brown on September 20th. He had been a Patriot for 13 days. He played 59 snaps. Nike ended their endorsement deal that same week, quietly, without a press release, a one-line statement: Antonio Brown is no longer a Nike athlete. Helmet manufacturer Zenith, which had announced a partnership with him just weeks earlier, terminated it. In approximately 12 months, Antonio Brown had exited Pittsburgh under a cloud, voided $30 million in Oakland, guarantees before a single snap, been released in New England after 13 days, lost his primary endorsement deal, and been named in a federal civil lawsuit alleging rape. $65 million in contracts, collected almost none of it. He was 31 years old. The next chapter is the one I've gone back and forth on the most in how to tell it, because there are 2 versions of what happened between 2020 and 2022, and both versions contain things that are genuinely true. And the honest way to tell this story is to hold both of them at the same time, which is uncomfortable. In January 2020, Brown was arrested outside his Hollywood, Florida home for allegedly assaulting a moving truck driver and his assistant during a dispute over furniture. He was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. His agent, Drew Rosenhaus, a man who had stood by players through things that would have ended most professional relationships, publicly stated that he would not represent Brown until Antonio sought help. That sentence from Rosenhaus landed differently than anything a team or a league official had said, because Rosenhaus represents players. That's the job. When your agent goes on the record and says, "I won't represent you until you get help," that's not a PR maneuver. That's a person who genuinely believes something is wrong. In April 2021, the civil lawsuit, Brittany Taylor's case, was settled privately. Terms were not disclosed. And then Tom Brady called again. Brady had gone to Tampa. He'd built something in his first year that looked like it might actually be a championship. And in October 2020, the Buccaneers signed Antonio Brown for $750,000 and an 8-game suspension. $750,000. A year earlier, he'd been the highest-paid receiver in football. But he was back. And he played. And in Super Bowl 55, February of 2021, Antonio Brown caught 3 passes for 47 yards and a touchdown against the Kansas City Chiefs. The Buccaneers won. He has a Super Bowl ring. That fact is permanent. Whatever came before and after, it sits there. The Bucs brought him back for 2021, up to $6.25 million. He played well enough in the first part of the season. It looked, to people watching from the outside, like maybe the story was going to turn. And then came January 2nd, 2022, and the Jets game, and the shirtless jog across the end zone, which is where we started. Here's what Brown said afterward: that the team had pressured him to play through an ankle injury he hadn't fully disclosed, that they had offered him $200,000 to enter mental health treatment as a condition of remaining on the roster, that there was nothing wrong with his mental health. Here is what the Buccaneers said: conduct detrimental to the team. Here is what I keep coming back to, and I don't have a clean answer for it. Both things can be true. A man can be in genuine distress, real, documented, serious distress, and simultaneously make it harder for anyone to reach him. Those aren't mutually exclusive. The NFL had a specific interest in Antonio Brown staying on the field as long as he was producing. Full stop. The question of whether anyone in that system had a genuine interest in what was happening inside his head, as opposed to what his catch radius looked like, is a different question. And I'm not sure the answer is flattering to anyone involved, but I also know that at some point, the decisions were his. Not the injury, not the lawsuit, not the frostbite, which I'll grant was just genuinely strange. But some of those decisions, specifically the ones that turned $30 million into nothing before a single snap, were made by one person. What I don't know, what none of us know, is what was happening inside his head when he made them. Whether there is a clinical explanation, whether the hits accumulated over 15 years of professional football had changed something in the architecture of his thinking in ways that weren't visible from the outside. We don't have the full picture. We may never have it. In May 2024, Antonio Brown filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. He listed his assets at less than $50,000. His career earnings, by the most conservative accounting, exceeded $80 million. The bankruptcy trustee assigned to the case filed a report saying that Brown's financial records were, in their words, impossible to determine, that there were unreported asset transfers, 3 properties that hadn't been disclosed, a financial history that even a professional examiner couldn't fully reconstruct. A court denied him a discharge on a $1.2 million judgment from the moving truck driver case, meaning even bankruptcy didn't wipe that one clean. The case was eventually converted from Chapter 11 to Chapter 7. In November 2025, Antonio Brown was arrested in Florida and charged with second-degree attempted murder stemming from a shooting incident outside a Miami boxing event. He pleaded not guilty. He filed a motion to dismiss under Florida's Stand Your Ground law. As of this recording, that case is still pending. If convicted, he faces up to 30 years. He is 36 years old. He posts online regularly. He has more followers than most active players. He puts out music. He released an album called Paradigm. There's a viral song. He plays shows. He's talked about real estate, about business, about a future he's still building in public, loudly, the way he's always done everything. For about a year, he served as president of Donda Sports, Kanye West's agency, until that relationship cooled as West's own situation became something else entirely. He had a stake in an Arena League team in Albany. The league kicked the team out mid-season when the payments stopped. He talks about the NFL sometimes, about wanting to play. No team is called. His kid's mother and the relationship there, public, unresolved, the way everything in his life is public and unresolved. He said in one interview that he owed the whole NFL an apology, that he needed help, that he understood something had gone wrong. In a different interview, weeks later, he said there was nothing wrong with his mental health, that the game had failed him, that the story being told about him was wrong. Both things exist, simultaneously, in the same person. I watched this man for 12 Sundays a year, for the better part of a decade. I had a very specific understanding of who he was, the work ethic, the hunger, the roots, the catches. The sixth-round kid who willed himself into a conversation with the best who ever played. I thought I knew what I was seeing. I was wrong. Not completely, but enough. Here is what I keep coming back to. In 2015, Antonio Brown was the best receiver in football. That's not a take. That's just what the numbers said and what your eyes confirmed if you watched him. He had everything ahead of him. Contracts, records, a bust in Canton, the whole architecture of a career that was going to mean something permanent. And somewhere between that moment and the shirtless jog in New Jersey, something went wrong that we still don't fully understand. The easy version is, he made his choices. He burned every bridge. He let pride and ego and some particular combination of stubbornness and self-destruction take a fortune and a legacy and light them on fire, one at a time, until there was nothing left. That version isn't wrong. But the harder version, the one I can't fully shake, is this. The system that loved Antonio Brown loved him the way it loves all of them, completely and conditionally, and only as long as he was useful. And the people around him, the teams, the agents, the league, had every incentive to keep him on the field, and very little incentive to look at what was happening underneath. I'm not sure which version explains more. Maybe neither one does on its own. You watched him play. You have an opinion about what happened. I want to leave you with one question, not a rhetorical one, an actual question that I haven't found a satisfying answer to. If the NFL had treated Antonio Brown the way it treats its most important business assets, with real investment in his long-term function, not just his short-term output, does this story end differently? I don't know. I'm not sure the league has ever seriously asked it.